The ground beneath Kale's boots hummed. Not the usual vibration of machinery in the walls, not the distant pulse of the geothermal vents that powered everything on this island. This was something older and angrier, a tremor that came from below the rock, below the steam pipes, below whatever the Vorkai had built their gleaming exhibition over. Kale felt it through his heels, through the soles of boots that had walked 3 continents before this island, swallowed him whole. He felt it the way a man feels a lie, not in the ears, but somewhere lower, somewhere the body knows before the mind catches up. He pressed his back against the cooling tower wall and looked at the girl beside him. Mira had her eyes closed. She was counting. 7, she whispered. 8, 9. Her fingers were spread flat against the muscleful surface, reading the vibrations the way their grandmother had once read the spines of library books, by touch, by feel, by some accumulated knowledge that didn't quite have a name. It's getting closer to the surface. How long? Maybe an hour, maybe less. She opened her eyes. They were gray in the dim light, the color of the sea around this island at dawn. Kale, if we're still in the exhibition complex we won't be. You said that about the intake station, and we weren't in the intake station when it burned. We were in the ventilation shaft above it, which is technically, Mira. She closed her mouth. Not because she agreed with him, but because he'd said her name the specific way their father used to say it, not sharp, not commanding, just waited. The name as an anchor, the name as a small temporary piece. Kale looked out through the grill and took stock. The Vorkai called it Specimen Hall 7. The humans who'd been brought here, the ones who'd been on this island longer than Kale's 6 weeks, had other names for it. The zoo. The show. The circus, though the man who called it that, a Canadian named Harlow with a missing ear and a persistent cough, had been moved to a different sector 3 days ago and hadn't been seen since. Kale preferred to think of it as what it plainly was, a display. The Vorkai had not, as far as anyone could tell, built the island. They had found it, a small volcanic atoll in the mid-Atlantic, barely large enough to land a transport on, geothermally active in exactly the ways the Vorkai found useful. They had arrived 16 months ago with their construction platforms and tunneling machines and their biomechanical war beasts, and they had built. Within 8 weeks, the island had a name in Vorkai navigational records. Rethavos, which translated roughly to instructional exhibit, or, depending on which captured linguist you asked, trophy display. The humans who'd been collected from the coastal settlements and the overrun evacuation ships had been brought here not as prisoners of war, not as slaves, but as specimens. The Vorkai were scholars. This was in many ways more disturbing than if they'd simply been conquerors. They had studied humanity with the patient, detached curiosity of researchers cataloging a newly discovered ecosystem. They had watched, documented, filmed, and, for reasons that remained imperfectly understood, demonstrated. Specimen Hall 7 was the latest in a series of what Harlow, before his disappearance, had called the exhibitions. Elaborate recreations of human environments, staffed by human beings who were watched through the walls by Vorkai observers. Hall 3 had been a hospital. Hall 5 had been a schoolroom. Hall 7 was a market, a careful reconstruction of a Mediterranean fishing market, complete with fake fish on ice, fake sunlight through solar panels in the ceiling, and real humans going about fake commerce under the quiet, unblinking attention of alien eyes. Kale had lasted 6 days in Hall 7 before he'd found the ventilation shaft. He'd been in the shafts for 4 weeks. He'd found Mira in the 3rd week. She'd worked out how to access them from Hall 4, which had been a recreation of a hospital waiting room, and she'd been living in the walls long enough that she'd mapped nearly a third of the complex. Her maps were drawn in the dust with her finger and memorized, never written down. The Vorkai could see writing. They couldn't see what was inside a person's head, at least not yet. "There's a man in the new intake," Mira said, her voice dropping below a whisper. "They brought him in 2 days ago. He was on one of the eastern fishing boats, the ones that tried to run the blockade near the Azores. He's been talking. Loudly. The observers are very interested. What's he saying? He keeps telling them that we'll burn this place down, that humanity isn't something you can put in a box and study, that we don't work that way." She paused. "The thing is, I don't think the Vorkai understand it as a threat. I think they're filing it under interesting behavioral pattern, category, defiant vocalization." Kale almost smiled. They would. His name is Beckett, former maritime engineer, and Kale, she hesitated in a way she almost never did. "He was on the Concordia. He knew your father." The almost smile stopped being almost anything at all. Kale's father had been on the Concordia when it went down. The Concordia had been a civilian research vessel, converted in the early days of the war to something between a refugee carrier and a recon ship, not fast enough to escape, not armed enough to fight, too valuable to abandon. The Vorkai had taken it intact, which meant everyone aboard had been processed, which meant Kale's father was, statistically, on an island somewhere, being studied. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then he opened them. How do we get to intake? Mira pulled out nothing, because she had nothing to pull out, and traced a route in the air with her index finger instead. The war beasts were what everyone talked about in the early days. Before the world had adapted to the reality of the Vorkai, before the military had developed protocols, before the civilian population had learned the difference between a Vorkai patrol drone and a Vorkai combat unit, before the language had caught up with the new world, the war beasts were the thing that filled the dispatches and the nightmares. They were not, technically, alive. The Vorkai had no equivalent to the word robot in any of their recorded language, because the distinction between mechanical and biological was, for them, a distinction without meaning. The war beasts were built. They had the skeleton of a machine, the joints, the pressure actuators, the processing cores that ran their targeting and locomotion. But the skin was biological, grown in Vorkai fabrication vats from proteins that no xenobiologist had quite been able to classify. It moved right. It breathed after a fashion. In low light, from a distance, it was easy to mistake one for something that had simply evolved that way. Something large and terrible and ancient, shaped by millions of years of predation rather than by alien engineering. The Vorkai ran them on geothermal pressure. This was, as Kale had noted when he'd first encountered one of the beasts patrolling the outer corridors of the exhibition complex, an elegant solution. The island produced more thermal energy than any conventional power source could have. The beasts were fitted with pressure intake vents along their flanks. The Vorkai called them something unpronounceable, but Mira had started calling them gills, and the name had stuck. And the geothermal steam that vented constantly from the island's volcanic substrate kept them running at full capacity. There were 43 of them on the island. Kale knew this because the man who'd been in the shafts longest, a former oil rig worker named Danvers, Welsh, with a great gray beard and the calmest eyes Kale had ever seen on a person under sustained duress, had spent 3 months counting them. Danvers had a notebook made from the backing of exhibition signage and a pen improvised from a wire and a small pool of condensation rust. He was, Kale had decided, the most useful person on the island and possibly the most remarkable. Danvers had also, 6 days ago, discovered something about the war beasts. They had a pattern, not a predictable patrol route. The Vorkai had designed those to be pseudo-random, varying enough to prevent the humans from mapping them. But there was another pattern, embedded in the locomotion algorithms. When the beasts were in a low-threat state, moving at maintenance pace through secured areas, not actively hunting, their pressure regulation systems fell into a kind of idle rhythm. The intake vents cycled at a specific rate. The legs moved in a specific cadence. It was not quite walking. It was not quite marching. It was, Danvers had noted in his careful handwriting, almost musical, like a slow count. 1 step in 3-4, 1 step in 3-4. Kale had looked at the notebook for a long time. That's the mambo, he'd said. Danvers had stared at him. It's a dance. Latin. My mother taught it to me. 1 step and 3-4. That's the basic step. That's literally the count for the basic mambo step. Kale had felt something strange and specific happening in his chest, a feeling he associated with very bad situations that contained, hidden inside, a very small door. Why would an alien war machine be running a pressure regulation cycle that matches a Cuban dance step? Probably isn't Cuban from their perspective, Danvers had said. And then he'd smiled for the first time since Kale had known him. The intake processing center was on the northeast side of the complex, built against the outside of the main geothermal vent stack. Kale and Mira moved through the shafts in the dark, Mira leading, Kale 2 feet behind her, both of them silent, in the way of people who have doing dangerous things in small spaces, long enough to stop thinking about them consciously, and start operating on something quieter and more reliable. The shafts were not designed for human occupation. They were maintenance conduits for the exhibition complex's environmental systems. Pressurized air, heat exchange, moisture control. Kale had learned, painfully, that there were sections that got hot enough to burn, and sections that flooded periodically with recycled water. He'd burned his forearm in the 3rd week, and the scar had healed badly in the damp. He touched it sometimes without meaning to, the way a person touches a tooth that's been pulled, feeling for the absence, reassuring themselves it's gone. They had to cross the geothermal processing hub to reach intake. This was the worst part of any route through the northeast quadrant. The hub was a large open chamber, 3 stories tall, where the island's thermal vents were collected and regulated before being distributed to the war beast. maintenance systems, and the exhibition complex power grid. There were always war beasts in the hub. The Vorkai used them to monitor the pressure gauges along the walls, which was one of the more baffling things about the Vorkai. They had the technology to automate that process completely, but seemed to prefer using the war beasts for it. Mira's theory was that the beasts were as much demonstration as function. The Vorkai wanted the human specimens to see the war beasts at rest as often as they saw them in motion. A reminder, a context. Look at what we have built. Look at what guards you. Be impressed. Be appropriately humble. Kale had a different theory, which he kept to himself. The Vorkai were not certain. The war beasts were reliable enough to leave unsupervised for long periods, and the hub's maintenance role was as much a test as a duty. They came out above the hub through a grill Mira had already loosened. Below them, 40 feet down, 3 war beasts moved through their maintenance cycles in the orange-tinted geothermal light. They were large. The smallest was the size of an adult rhinoceros, the largest probably 4 tons, and they moved with a heavy, rhythmic deliberateness. The gill vents along their flanks opened and closed in the steam. Their processing cores pulsed with a slow amber light behind the bioskin, visible at the rib cage, like something almost like a heartbeat. 1 step and 3-4, 1 step and 3-4. Kale watched them for a moment. They were objectively extraordinary. He'd understood that from the first moment he'd seen one, even through the fear, even through the immediate processing of threat distance exit, the Vorkai had made something that occupied a space biology had never reached. Large predatory machines that moved with the organic ease of something born rather than built. The bioskin caught the light in ways metal wouldn't. The joints moved with a fluid precision that engineering alone couldn't fully explain. Someone had put something into these things that was not purely computational, and whatever that something was, it was why Kale's fight-or-flight response treated them as animals, despite what he knew. "They're calmer than usual," Mira whispered. She was right. The 3 beasts in the hub were running at the lowest observable activity state. Idle maintenance pace, pressure vents cycling slowly, locomotion barely above a drift. The amber glow of the processing cores was dim. "The tremors," Kale said. "They're calibrating to it, compensating for the ground movement. That would mean they've been sensing the tremors longer than we have. Probably. Their pressure intake systems would pick up subseismic vibrations." He watched one of the beasts complete a slow circuit of the gauge wall, which means they're already operating with part of their processing capacity dedicated to compensation. They're quieter because they're busy. Mira looked at him. "You think that makes them safer to pass?" "I think it makes the calculus different." It wasn't the same as safer. But Kale had learned, over a long career of not dying in situations that should have killed him, that different calculus was often all you got, and you took it. They got to intake. Beckett was in the 3rd holding cell, a room that looked, with the Vorkai's characteristic attention to unsettling detail, exactly like a moderately comfortable ship's cabin. Bunk, table, porthole-shaped viewport showing a fake seascape. The viewport was a screen. Beyond it, Kale knew, was a rock wall and then the Atlantic. Beckett was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of the bunk with his hands on his knees, looking at nothing, doing the specific thing that people do when they are not meditating and not thinking and not sleeping, but are instead conserving themselves, running at minimal output, keeping the machinery ticking over, waiting for something to change. He was older than Kale had expected, 60 maybe, a sailor's face, weathered in the permanent way, the color and texture of someone who'd spent decades with the wind and salt having at them. His hands were large and scarred in multiple directions, the kind of scarring that came from working with machinery and rope and metal over a long lifetime rather than from any single event. Kale tapped the grill. Beckett looked up immediately. His eyes focused with a speed that told Kale he hadn't been anywhere near as absent as he'd appeared. "Ventilation shaft," Beckett said, as if noting it. "How long have you been in there?" 4 weeks, Kale said, keeping his voice at the register that didn't carry past the grill. "I need to know about the Concordia." Something moved across Beckett's face. Not grief, exactly. Something older and more resolved than grief. The emotional state that comes after grief has been lived with long enough to become structural. "You have family on her. My father, Dr. Marcus Harlan, senior xenobiologist." Beckett nodded slowly. "I knew Marcus. He's alive. Or he was, 4 months ago. They took him off to another facility, separate from the general population. The Vorkai were particularly interested in him, because Marcus Harland had spent 12 years studying alien biosystems before the Vorkai arrived, because he'd published 7 papers on theoretical xenobiology that, in retrospect, had turned out to be not theoretical at all, Because when the Vorkai came, Marcus Harland was one of perhaps 30 people on Earth who had the background to begin understanding what they were dealing with, and the Vorkai, being scholars, had noticed. Which facility? Your father called it the archive. I don't know what the Vorkai call it. Beckett paused. He said to tell anyone who came looking that the war beasts have a cooling failure threshold. The pressure cores, the geothermal intake drives the pressure, but the bioskin can't handle extreme thermal variance. If the geothermal supply becomes unstable, if the pressure spikes past a certain level, the cores overheat and the regulation system locks up. The beasts shut down. He'd seen it happen during a test malfunction. Another pause. He'd also been studying the locomotion algorithms. He said there was something in the idle state cycle that looked like it had been derived from a music pattern library. Cale stared at him for a moment. The mambo, he said. Beckett blinked. I don't know what that means. It means my father was the most remarkable man I've ever known, and apparently he did a lot of useful work while being a prisoner. Cale looked at Mira. She was looking back at him with the expression she got when multiple things were becoming clear simultaneously. You feel the ground? Beckett nodded. Since this morning, the island's going to go. Not the volcano, the seismic activity around the thermal vents, the pressure system that feeds the war beasts. When the earthquake hits, it won't shut them down. It'll drive the pressure past sustainable levels. The beasts will go into some kind of crisis state. He thought about Danvers' notebook, about the mambo rhythm, about the cooling failure threshold his father had documented from inside captivity. But there's a window between when the pressure destabilizes and when it becomes critical, a period when the beasts are already compensating for ground vibration and not yet in overload. They'll still be running their idle state locomotion pattern, the one that matches the mambo rhythm. You want to move through them, Mira said. It wasn't a question. During the window, if we move in the right rhythm, if we match the step pattern, we're not triggering their threat detection. They're tuned to detect chaotic, unpredictable movement. A human running, a human fighting, a human in panic. But the idle pattern is 1 step and 3-4. If we walk to that count, exactly, we're acoustically and kinetically invisible. To war beasts doing a mambo, Beckett said. To war beasts in idle maintenance mode, whose threat detection is processing a seismic event, Cale said. Yes, Beckett looked at him for a long moment. He had, Cale realized, the same quality that Danvers had, that particular kind of stillness that very experienced people, under very difficult circumstances sometimes, arrived at, where stillness stopped being absence of motion and became a kind of presence, a decision being made in slow, deliberate increments. Your father said you'd know what to do, Beckett said finally. He said if anyone on this island worked it out, it'd be you. Cale said nothing. He said you were stubborn to the point of being genuinely annoying, and you never knew when to stop thinking about a problem, and you'd keep at something long after any sensible person would have let it go. A pause. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. Cale looked at the floor of the ventilation shaft for a moment. His throat did something complicated, and he dealt with it by moving on. We need to find Danvers, he said, and we need to go now. Danvers was where Danvers always was, in the junction point between Shift 14C and the main east-west arterial, sitting cross-legged in the dark with his notebook open on his knee, writing by touch in the light-deprived way he'd spent 3 months developing. Cale told him about the pressure threshold and the locomotion pattern. Danvers listened with his eyes closed, which was a habit of his when receiving information. He processed better in the dark, he said, always had. When Cale finished, Danvers opened his eyes. How many people do we take, he said. Everyone we can reach in the next 40 minutes, Mira said. After that, the seismic activity gets too unpredictable to rely on. The halls, Danvers said. We'll need to get into the halls. This was the harder calculation. The people in the shafts, Cale's network, the 14 men and women who'd found their way out of the exhibitions and into the maintenance conduits, were mobile and accustomed to moving fast. The people still in the halls were in a different situation. They were being watched. They were being studied. Extracting them would mean going visibly into the exhibition spaces, moving people through observation zones, and doing it all quickly enough that the Vorkai monitors didn't respond before the window opened. Hall 3, Cale said. Hall 5. 7. How many people total? 63, Danvers said immediately. He'd been counting those too. 63 people. 40 minutes. 43 war beasts in various states of pre-seismic compensation. The exhibition complex was a maze, deliberately designed to disorient. The Vorkai had, with their characteristic attention to detail, built the human habitat sections to be labyrinthine, because humans in the original environments they were based on tended to navigate by familiar, landmarks rather than spatial mapping. You were meant to be lost. You were meant to need the Vorkai's infrastructure to find your way. The beasts will go into overload when the quake hits, Kale said. And when they do, the Vorkai will respond. They'll be managing a crisis. They'll have less capacity for the humans and specimens. He looked at Danvers. What happens to the exhibition halls during a power disruption? Danvers turned a page in his notebook. Automatic lockdown. The habitat rooms seal. Environmental systems go to battery backup. He looked up. Except Hall 7. Hall 7 has an external door. They installed it 4 days ago. I watched the construction drones do it. I don't know why, but there's a physical exit on the south face of the complex that was never there before. Why would they build an exit? Maybe they were planning to expand, Mira said slowly. Thurston, the senior exhibition director, the one who designed all of this. I've been watching him through the monitoring junction near his workspace. He's been arguing with the senior Vorkai council about the island's capacity. He thinks the current facility is too small. He's been planning a second phase. She paused. He was going to open Hall 7 to the outside as part of a demonstration. Show the council that controlled, supervised exterior access was possible. Thurston built us a door, Beckett said. Thurston built himself a demonstration project, Mira said. We're going to use it differently than he intended. The senior exhibition director's name in Vorkai, as best as anyone had managed to phonetically approximate, was something like Thursavin. The humans had been calling him Thurston for 4 months, which had started as a simple corruption and gradually acquired the specific emotional weight that a name gets when it becomes associated with the source of a person's suffering. KL had seen him twice through the monitoring junctions. He was large for a Vorkai. They ran to a height of roughly 7 feet, bilateral symmetry, 4-limbed, with a secondary pair of articulated sensory appendages at the shoulder that served functions somewhere between ears and antennae. Their skin was a deep gray-green, slightly iridescent in direct light, which was part of why they preferred the kind of dimmed, amber-tinted illumination that pervaded the exhibition complex. Thurston was taller than average and moved with the specific energy of someone who had built something they were proud of and wanted everyone to notice. He had, by all accounts, designed every detail of the island himself. The exhibition halls, the war beast deployment patterns, the environmental systems. He had recruited the human specimens personally from the processing centers, had, according to a woman named Aisha in Hall 5 who'd been processed early, actually argued with the military commanders for certain individuals on the basis of their demonstration value. He had fought, evidently, for resources and for expansion and for the island's continued operation. He had also, 3 days ago, begun showing signs that something was wrong. The monitoring junction near his workspace let Mira observe him during what appeared to be review sessions. Thurston going through footage, making notes, doing whatever Vorkai did when they were assessing the quality of their research. But for the past 3 days, he'd been doing something else. He'd been sitting very still. He'd been running the same footage segments repeatedly. Footage of Hall 3, Mira thought the hospital recreation, footage of the waiting area. He keeps stopping on the same moment, Mira had told KL. An older woman in Hall 3, Mrs. Perot. She had a bad fall 2 days ago. She's 74. She's been struggling with the conditions. The Hall 3 medic treated her, and then one of the younger residents sat with her, held her hand. For 40 minutes, just held her hand. Mira had been quiet for a moment. Thurston has watched that footage 6 times. Kale hadn't known what to do with that information, so he'd filed it now. Moving down through the shafts toward Hall 3 with Danvers at his shoulder and Beckett behind him and Mira somewhere in the parallel conduit running toward Hall 7, he thought about it again. The Vorkai were scholars. They had come here to study humans, which meant, presumably, they had come here with hypotheses, with questions they expected the study to answer. And whatever Thurston had hypothesized about humans before he built this island, the footage of Mrs. Perot and the young woman holding her hand had given him an answer he hadn't expected. That was the thing about humans, Kale thought. They were harder to study than they looked. They started in Hall 3 because that's where Mrs. Perot was, and Mrs. Perot was, in the strange democracy of extended captivity, someone people deferred to. She was 74, and she'd been a surgical nurse for 40 years, and she'd delivered 2 babies in the field during a hurricane, and she had the kind of face that made people trust her instinctively, not because it was a kind face, it was actually rather a severe face, but because it was a face that had clearly been tested many times and had not flinched. Kale came down through the ceiling access panel, and she was the first person who saw him. She looked up, looked at the access panel, looked back at him. Finally, she said. He told her the plan in 30 seconds. She listened. asked two questions: how much time, and did he know the layout of the exterior south face? And then she stood up, despite the fall she'd had 2 days ago, and began quietly moving through the hospital recreation, touching shoulders, bending down to whisper. It took 11 minutes to get all 12 people in Hall 3 ready to move. Hall 5 was harder. The schoolroom recreation had been running for 4 months, and the residents had, in some cases, begun to comply in ways that were difficult to see, not broken, not lost, but adapted. Adapted to the specific rhythms of the exhibition. The Vorkai observers in the monitoring stations behind the one-way glass had been watching Hall 5 residents read from a curriculum the Vorkai had designed, human knowledge, presented in a form the Vorkai had determined to be standard educational context. 3 of the Hall 5 residents had been going along with it. 2 of them barely looked up when Kale came through the ceiling. The one who responded immediately was a teenage boy named Salim, who had the burning, specific alertness of someone who has been waiting for exactly this for a very long time. The robots are quieter, Salim said instantly. I noticed yesterday. Something's happening. Earthquake, Kale said. Big one soon. We're leaving. Salim turned to the 2 residents, who hadn't looked up. He spoke to them in Arabic and then in French, and then, when neither worked, he crouched down beside one of them, a middle-aged man with blank eyes, and put both hands on the man's shoulders. Monsieur Devereaux, he said, in careful English. There is a door. We found a door. Do you want to see what's outside? Something moved in the man's face. Something that had been somewhere far away came back. Outside, Devereaux repeated. Outside, Salim confirmed. Hall 7 was the hardest. The market recreation was the most elaborate of the 3 halls. Larger, more populated, more comprehensively monitored. 39 people. 11 Vorkai observation stations. The fake Mediterranean light and the fake Mediterranean fish and the decades of fake transactions that had been building for weeks. And Thurston was there. Not physically, the Vorkai senior staff didn't enter the exhibition spaces, as far as anyone knew. But the monitoring junction nearest to Hall 7's central space had 2 feeds, and on the secondary feed, Mira had seen Thurston's workspace. He was watching Hall 7's live feed. Right now, in real time, he was watching the people in the market go about their day. Mira had gone in anyway. She came through the access panel in the storage room at the back of the market reconstruction, the one the Vorkai had built to add verisimilitude to the space. A small, dark room stacked with prop supplies for the exhibition. She'd come in fast, and she'd found the 3 people who were in on the network, an Italian fisherman named Gennaro, a Scottish marine biologist named Isla, and a former hotel manager from Cyprus named Nicholas, who had been, in the extraordinary way of certain people, in extraordinary circumstances, running a quiet pastoral care system for the entire hall from his position as market supervisor in the exhibition. Nicholas already knew something was wrong with the equipment. He'd noticed the war beasts through the ventilation slats 3 days ago. They are moving differently, he'd told Gennaro in a low voice during one of their quiet conversations at the fake fish counter. Something underground is changing. When Mira explained the plan, Nicholas listened and then nodded once, with the particular economy of someone who has been making hard decisions for a long time and has streamlined the process. I'll get them ready, he said. You tell me when. The first tremor hit at 1447. Kale felt it standing in the main junction shaft, which was the meeting point for all 3 extraction routes, the place where the streams of people from Halls 3, 5, and 7 would converge before moving to the Hall 7 external door. He'd been standing there for 6 minutes, listening to the ground, counting people as they came through. 41, 42, 43. The tremor came up through his feet and kept coming, longer and deeper than the morning vibrations, a sustained rolling movement that made the shaft walls flex and produced a sound from somewhere below, like something vast being slowly torn apart. Then, from everywhere at once, the war beasts changed. Kale heard it before he felt it, a shift in the acoustic signature of the complex, the ambient thrum of 43 pressure cores changing register. Higher, faster, the idle mambo rhythm accelerating, the pressure compensation systems kicking into overdrive as the geothermal substrate lurched. Now, he said to no one and everyone, move now. 61 people moved. They moved through the junction and into the exhibition complex access corridor, a service passage that ran parallel to the main exhibition halls, used by the Vorkai maintenance systems, rarely occupied by the war beasts. Kale was at the front, Danvers on his left shoulder, Beckett on his right. Behind him, he could hear footsteps and breathing and the specific sound of a large group of people trying very hard not to make sound. At the end of the service corridor, the passage opened into a maintenance crossing, a wide open space 40 feet across, where 2 of the war beasts ran their regular circuits, They were running faster now. The pressure spike from the tremor had pushed them above idle into something that was not quite active threat mode, but was clearly elevated. Their bioskin was flushed with heat, the gill vents working hard, the amber glow of the processing cores intensifying. 1 step and 3-4. Faster now, but still the Mambo. Still the count. Kale looked back at the crowd behind him. 60 people. 60 people who had never heard of the Mambo, who hadn't been in the ventilation shafts, who didn't know about pressure cores or locomotion algorithms or his father's work from inside a Vorkai archive. He took a breath. There's a rhythm, he said, keeping his voice at the level of barely not silence. 1 step and 3-4. 1 step and 3-4. I want you to feel it in your feet and walk to it, exactly to it, not faster, not slower, stay in the count. If you lose the count, find it again before you take another step. Don't run, don't freeze, don't look at the beasts directly, just walk the count. Mrs. Perot, at the back of the crowd, picked it up first. He heard her start it, a whisper, 1 step and 3-4. Salim picked it up, then Gennaro, then Nicholas. Then it was running through the group like something contagious. 1 step and 3-4. 1 step and 3-4. Kale stepped out into the crossing. The war beast nearest to him was 5 feet away when he hit the first step. He felt his own heartbeat trying to break the rhythm and suppressed it. Focused on the count, focused on the feet. 1 step and 3-4. The beast's pressure compensation systems were at full wind now, all its processing dedicated to the thermal crisis, its threat detection tuned for chaos, for panic, for the running and screaming and desperate irregular movement that meant prey. What it heard, through its acoustic sensors, was the Mambo. It turned its head. Kale held the count. It looked at him, or looked in his direction. It was never entirely clear what looking meant for a war beast, and he felt the full weight of its threat assessment run over him like cold water. He held the count, 1 step and 3-4. Behind him, 60 people moved in the same rhythm, filling the crossing with the sound and the vibration of the basic Mambo step, and the war beast's threat detection found nothing to lock onto. It turned away. Kale kept walking. The second tremor hit when they were halfway down the service corridor that led to Hall 7's south face. This one was serious. The walls buckled. The lighting system. The amber-tinted overhead strips that the Vorkai had installed throughout the exhibition complex flickered and died. Someone behind Kale stumbled and Danvers caught them without breaking stride. From deep in the complex came the sound of things failing. Pressure lines? Conduit walls? The massive mechanical systems that had been running this island for 16 months, suddenly working against a substrate that was trying to shake them apart. And then the war beasts went into overload. The sound was nothing like Kale had imagined. He'd expected something mechanical, a gear grind, a system failure. What he got instead was something biological and enormous, a sound from all over the complex at once, from 43 pressurized biomechanical bodies hitting their thermal ceiling simultaneously. Not a scream, not quite. More like a resonance, the sound of something very large and very powerful in the moment before it stops being what it was. Then the corridor was full of steam. The pressure cores were venting through the gill vents. Uncontrolled, too high-pressure steam, billowing from the bodies of war beasts throughout the complex as the regulation systems failed. The processing cores were going dark one by one. Kale could feel it more than see it, a change in the acoustic signature of the complex as the amber glow faded and the rhythmic footfalls stumbled and stopped. Run, he said. They ran. Hall 7's south face had the door Thurston had built. It was not. Kale noted as they reached it, the modest utility door he'd been imagining. Thurston had been planning a demonstration, and Thurston did not do modest. The door was large enough to move equipment through, large enough to be impressive. It had a locking mechanism that Mira was already working on, her hands moving over the control panel with the specific fluency of someone who'd spent 3 weeks in the walls watching Vorkai maintenance drones operate every system in the complex. 20 seconds, she said. Behind them, the exhibition complex was in chaos. The power was cutting in and out. The war beasts were either shut down or stumbling through damaged locomotion cycles. Somewhere in the north section, something had caught fire. One of the steam lines that had been designed to be a heating element in the market reconstruction, now rupturing through a cracked wall. The smell of burning synthetic material mixed with the mineral smell of the volcanic steam and the salt air, smell that was coming faintly through the door as Mira got the locking mechanism open. The door swung out. The Atlantic, gray and enormous and immediate 40 feet below them at the base of the island's south-facing cliff, lit by the particular light of a late afternoon that had been interrupted by volcanic events. The air hit KL in the face with the indiscriminate force of weather that knew nothing of exhibition halls and war beasts and alien scholarship. It smelled like salt and cold and the specific kind of freedom that only exists in contrast to its absence. Behind him, 61 people stopped running. For about 2 seconds, no more, they stood at the threshold and looked at the ocean. Then Mrs. Perot walked past KL and stood at the edge of the doorway and looked down at the cliff face. There are handholds, she said, with the manner of someone assessing a medical situation. The rock erosion pattern. Natural formation, fairly regular. We can get down. We need boats, someone said. The Vorkai brought us by transport, Danvers said. That means there's a dock on this island somewhere. The north face, almost certainly, the side away from the volcanic activity. He was already pulling out his notebook. I have a route. Kale turned to look back into the exhibition complex. The chaos was real, but it wasn't total. He could see, through the emergency lighting that had kicked in parts of the complex, shapes moving that were too tall and too coordinated to be humans in crisis. The Vorkai staff, responding to the system failure, managing their exhibition, trying to reassert control. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about a man in an archive somewhere who had studied the war beasts from inside captivity and had sent word through a maritime engineer on a captured fishing boat that the pressure cores had a seal scene, who had found in the locomotion algorithms of alien war machines a Cuban dance step and had trusted that his son would know what to do with it. I need 5 minutes, Kale said. Mira looked at him. Get them down the cliff, he said. Get them to the dock. Danvers knows the route. I'll be right behind you. Kale, 5 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment with the gray eyes that had been counting tremors since this morning. Then she turned to Danvers and said, go, and turned back to Kale and said, 3 minutes, and then she went. He found Thurston in the monitoring hub adjacent to Hall 7. The monitoring hub was a long, low room, Vorkai proportioned, which meant just tall enough to be uncomfortable for a human, filled with the bank of screens and recording systems that the senior exhibition director used to watch his project. Most of the screens were dark now, the exhibition feeds gone to static or to emergency lighting. The ones that were still running showed various angles of the exhibition complex in various stages of disruption. Thurston was standing very still in the center of the room. He was larger than Kale had remembered from the monitoring junction footage, and there was something in his posture that Kale recognized, despite the alien geometry of the body, the specific posture of someone watching, something they built fall apart, not panic, not anger. Something older and quieter, the posture of a person in the moment they understand that they were wrong about something fundamental. Kale stood in the doorway. Thurston turned. His secondary sensory appendages went wide, the alien equivalent, Kale had gathered, of a sharp intake of breath. They looked at each other. You built this, Kale said. He wasn't accusing, he was just noting it. Thurston made a sound. Not language, at least not language that Kale had any purchase on. But the sounds carried something recognizable. Acknowledgement. Yes, I built this. You watched that woman in Hall 3, Kale said. Mrs. Perot, and the girl who sat with her. He paused. Why did you keep watching that? No translation was possible, but Thurston was very still. We don't work the way you thought, Kale said. You built exhibitions. You built demonstrations. You built a study. And then you kept watching the same 40 minutes of an old woman having her hand held. He let that sit for a moment, because that wasn't in your model, right? That wasn't in whatever you were studying for, the hand-holding, the sitting with someone, just sitting, not doing anything useful, not producing anything observable, just being there. Something in Thurston's posture shifted. It was not human movement, not any specific gesture that mapped to something Kale could name, but it was change, and the change looked something like what humans look like when something that has been held very rigid for a very long time finally lets go. Kale reached into the pocket of his jacket, the jacket he'd been wearing for 6 weeks in a ventilation shaft, and that smelled accordingly, and he pulled out the last thing he had from before the island, a small flask, dented tin, the kind that had been standard issue for naval personnel for about 50 years. Empty now. Had been empty for a month. He kept it because he kept it the way a person keeps something that has no current use, but has accumulated enough history to become structural. He set it on the console in front of Thurston. My father did biology before you got here, Kale said. He was trying to understand you, not to fight you, to understand. He paused. That's also a very human thing. You might want to note it. He walked out. The cliff face was navigable, barely, in the way that things are navigable when the alternative is not navigating them. Mrs. Perot had been right about the handholds. The volcanic erosion patterns gave purchase at regular intervals, and Salim who turned out to have done some climbing in his previous life, had gone down first and was calling up guidance from below. Kale got down in 4 minutes. Mira was waiting at the base, looking at her watch, in the way people look at watches when they are trying to demonstrate patience without actually feeling it. 3 minutes, she said. You said 3. I needed 4. What did you do? I'm not entirely sure, Kale said honestly. He looked up the cliff at the exhibition complex. The steam was visible from here, pouring from the south face where pressure lines had ruptured. The building was not on fire. Not really. The Vorkai had been built well enough to contain most of it, but it was clearly not operational, and clearly not the study it had been this morning. Did you hurt anyone? No. Mira looked at him with an expression that contained several questions she decided not to ask. They went around the island on the path Danvers had mapped, moving along the base of the cliffs, with the Atlantic close on their left, and the sounds of the damaged complex fading above them. The group stretched out over 100 yards of rough terrain. 63 people from Hall 3 and 5, and 7 plus Kale and Mira and Beckett and Danvers. Nicholas had his arm around Devereaux, who was walking steadily and looking at the sky with an expression of careful wonder, as if he was checking whether it was still there. Salim was walking with 3 of the younger Hall 3 residents, telling them something in rapid French that was producing, despite everything, the occasional suppressed laugh. Gennaro was humming. After a moment, Kale realized what he was humming. 1 step and 3-4. He hummed it without thinking about it, walking the same path they'd all walked through the War Beast crossing. The rhythm had gotten into him. Kale listened to it and felt something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite joy but contained something of all of them. The specific feeling of being more than what someone thought you were, of having moved through the impossible because someone told you about a dance your mother taught you and a pressure threshold your father found in an alien machine. The dock was on the north face, exactly where Danvers had calculated. 2 Vorkai transport vessels, large and utilitarian, built for logistics rather than speed. They were currently unmanned. The Vorkai crew had presumably evacuated to the interior of the island when the quake hit. Beckett looked at the controls for approximately 45 seconds. Maritime engineer, he said, apparently to himself. Right. They were 3 miles out when the second major tremor hit the island. From the water, they watched the south face of the volcanic island produce a spectacular and sustained release of pressure. Not an eruption, not in the traditional sense, but a venting. The accumulated thermal energy of the geothermal system, freed from the regulation infrastructure that had been containing it, going into the sky in a column of steam and rock and a specific kind of finality. The exhibition complex was on the south face. Kale stood at the stern of the transport and watched. He was thinking about his father, in an archive somewhere. He was thinking at about 30 years of xenobiology preparing a man to find a dance step in an alien war machine and know that his son would understand it. He was thinking about what it meant that Thurston had watched the same 40 minutes of footage 6 times, what it meant that the scholar who'd built the exhibition had been surprised by what he found there. The archive, Beckett said, coming to stand beside him. The facility where they took your father. I don't know exactly where it is, but I know it's not far from one of the major coastal processing centers. Maybe a week by boat from here, if we can resupply. Kale nodded. Your father said something else, Beckett said. I almost forgot, with everything. A pause. He said, tell Kale the thing about the dance isn't that it's useful. The thing about the dance is what it means that we can do it. That we're the kind of species that when we found something moving in a specific pattern in the dark, our first response was to recognize it as music. Kale looked at the steam column rising from the island. He thought about 63 people walking in the dark to a count of 1 step and 3-4 through 43 overloaded war machines, finding the rhythm in the middle of the impossible and holding it. He thought about an old woman's hand being held for 40 minutes, while an alien scholar watched from behind glass and felt the first crack in everything he'd assumed. He thought about his father, somewhere ahead of them, alive. Go, he said to Beckett. Let's go find him. They didn't find the archive in a week. It took 19 days. The transport was not fast, and it needed fuel it couldn't carry, and twice they were detected by Vorkai patrol drones and had to run dark and cold in the water for hours, engines off, everyone below deck doing the particular held-breath silence of people hiding from something that might be looking. Salim, who was 17, and had apparently decided that the end of the world was a reasonable time to develop a sense of humor, kept the tension from becoming unbearable during the long cold hours. He had a gift for it, a way of finding the edge of something terrible and saying exactly the right absurd thing that made the terrible momentarily less total. Mrs. Perot taught him Oisher during the second dark running. Nicholas won every hand and refused to explain how. Danvers wrote in his notebook. He was, Cale realized as the days went on, writing something larger than observation notes. He was writing a record, a complete account, the island, the exhibition complex, the war beasts, the pressure threshold, the Mambo solution, the escape, all of it in careful handwriting on backing material from Vorkai exhibition signage. He was writing it with the specific intentionality of someone who understands that what happened needs to be known by people who weren't there. In case something happens to you? Cale asked one evening. In case something happens to any of us, Danvers said. But also because it happened. Because we were here, and it happened, and it should be written down. He looked at the notebook. Things that get written down stay true, in a way that memory doesn't always manage. On the 12th day, they picked up 3 more people. Survivors from a different facility. A smaller detention holding on a converted oil platform, who'd gotten free when the platform's power systems failed during a secondary tremor from the original island event. One of them, a woman named Chen, who'd been a structural engineer, had information about the archive facility's location that matched Beckett's intelligence closely enough to triangulate. On the 19th day, they found it. The archive was not an island. It was a coastal installation built into a clifftop above an inlet on what had been the Portuguese coast, camouflaged with the kind of thoroughness that suggested the Vorkai didn't want it noticed from the sea. It would have been invisible from a distance. From the water below the cliffs, in a small inflatable that Cale and Mira and Beckett were running silently at 3 a.m., it was almost invisible. Almost. There was a light in one of the upper levels. Not the amber Vorkai light, a different color. Warmer. Cale recognized it after a moment. A work lamp. A human work lamp, the kind that runs on a small battery pack and produces that specific warm yellow-white that nothing else quite matches. Someone inside was working by lamplight in the middle of the night. Getting into the archive was not simple. It was, in fact, the hardest thing Cale had done on an objective physical level since the island. Harder than the cliff, harder than the War Beast crossing, harder than 19 days on a commandeered alien transport. The archive's exterior was not an exhibition complex with maintenance shafts. It was a research facility with Vorkai security architecture that had not been designed to be passed through by human beings using Mambo rhythms and improvised tools. They got in anyway. Mira found a loading access point on the cliff face, a goods elevator entrance, used for bringing supplies up from the inlet. It had a mechanical lock rather than an electronic one, which meant Chen's structural engineering knowledge applied in ways that a digital system wouldn't have allowed. It took 40 minutes and 2 false starts, and one moment when a patrol drone came close enough that all 3 of them had to press flat against the cliff face in the dark and not breathe. But they got in. The archive was different from the exhibition complex in every way. Quieter, smaller, dense with equipment that Cale didn't recognize, and books, actual physical books, which the Vorkai had apparently collected from human facilities throughout the war. There were hundreds of them, filed on shelving that lined an entire corridor, organized in ways that were not alphabetical or chronological, but seemed, as Beckett pointed out, to be organized by subject category according to some Vorkai schema. The light was coming from a room at the end of the corridor. Cale went to the room alone. His father was sitting at a workbench covered in things that were neither entirely human nor entirely Vorkai, equipment that had been adapted, modified, combined into something new by someone with enough knowledge of both systems to find the intersections. He was writing. He looked older than Cale remembered, and he looked entirely unbroken, which were 2 things that Cale had been afraid were mutually exclusive. Marcus Harland looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then his father said, in the tone of someone who has been working for a very long time at night and wants to contextualize a surprise. "You used the Mambo." "I used the Mambo," Cale confirmed. His father nodded slowly, with the expression of someone verifying a calculation that had come out right. Then he stood up and closed the distance and put his arms around his son. And Cale stood very still in the dark, warm room full of books and alien equipment and let himself for exactly as long as it took. Stop thinking about the next problem. They left the archive before dawn. Not all of them. They couldn't take everyone in the transport, and some of the archive's residents didn't want to go yet, which was a decision Cale respected without fully understanding. His father came. 3 other researchers came. A young linguist who'd been documenting Vorkai language patterns for 8 months came, with notebooks more comprehensive than even Danvers, and sat in the transport's hold going through them, with the intensity of someone who had found a use for everything they'd recorded. 17 days out, they made contact with what remained of organized human resistance, a naval coordination group operating from a base on an island in the North Atlantic that the Vorkai hadn't taken because it didn't have anything the Vorkai scholarship program wanted. It was cold and it was crowded and it was against all odds running. Kale gave them Danvers' notebooks. He gave them his father's research. He gave them the Mambo. He gave them specifically what his father had discovered in 4 months of studying the archive's collection of Vorkai materials. That the War Beast locomotion algorithms weren't just derived from a music pattern library, they were derived from human music specifically, because the Vorkai had spent a century observing Earth before they came, and had built their biomechanical systems using patterns they'd observed in human behavior as a baseline. The Mambo step was in the War Beasts because the Vorkai engineers had used recordings of human movement, dance, walking, collective rhythmic activity as the foundation for the beast's locomotion templates. They'd considered it efficient. They'd considered it a form of adaptation. They had not considered that the humans would recognize it. This was the thing about humans Marcus Harland had written in his notebook in the archive by lamplight in the middle of the night. We are pattern recognizers. It is the oldest and most fundamental thing we do. We found fire and lightning and rhythm and rain and stories and stars. We look at the world and find ourselves in it. And when the Vorkai built war machines from human movement, they put themselves inside a pattern we could read, and they never imagined we would read it, because reading it required being something they hadn't studied, a species that recognizes itself in the dark. The Resistance Command listened. They were a pragmatic group shaped by 16 months of very hard lessons, and they listened with the focused attention of people who have learned not to dismiss unusual information. Then one of the commanders, a woman named Admiral Vashti, with the particular dry authority of someone who has been right when nobody believed her often enough to stop explaining, herself looked at Kale and said, "Can you teach it? The Mambo, the principle, the pattern matching. If their locomotion algorithms are all based on human movement baselines, if we know the library they drew from, can we build a catalog? Every movement pattern that maps to a War Beast operational cycle?" Kale thought about it for a moment. He thought about 63 people walking in the dark. He thought about Mrs. Perot picking up the count first. He thought about Salim, 17 years old, finding the rhythm in the middle of the impossible and holding it, and later humming it along a cliff path because it had gotten into him the way music gets into you. He thought about the thing his father had written. We are pattern recognizers. Yes, Kale said. Yes took 3 months. 3 months of his father's research, and the linguist's notebooks, and Danvers' meticulous records, and the Resistance's accumulated battlefield data, all being synthesized into something that had never existed before, a human operational manual for moving through Vorkai War Beast territory, using pattern matching derived from the beast's own foundational design. Not just the Mambo. The Mambo was the idle cycle, the maintenance state. There were other cycles: active patrol, threat response, search and clear. Each one had a human movement baseline at its core. The active patrol cycle was derived from collective walking patterns, the kind of synchronized footfall that happened in crowds. The threat response was derived from athletic competition, the specific biomechanics of a sprinter coming out of the blocks. The search and clear was remarkably derived from a children's game. The Vorkai's century of Earth observation had included, apparently, extensive documentation of playground activities, and they had found something rhythmically useful in the specific pattern of hide and seek. Humans had been patterned into the War Beast's DNA, and humans could read it. The catalog went out through the Resistance Network in coded form. It went to the remnant military units still operating in the European interior. It went to the resistance cells in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean theater. It went to everyone who had been fighting Vorkai War Beasts in straight combat and losing, and when it arrived with Kale's name attached and a note from Admiral Vashti. The following information was obtained through human ingenuity, human stubbornness, and one Cuban dance step. The operational results were significant. Not transformative overnight. The war didn't end in a month. Wars don't end in a month. But the calculus changed. When you know the patterns your enemy has built into their weapons, you stop being ambushed by their weapons. You start being able to predict them. You start being able to set conditions, to construct situations where the War Beast's threat detection is occupied, where their patrol cycles can be read and their response times anticipated. You start winning small things, and small things accumulate. Thurston came eventually, not to surrender. The Vorkai weren't at that stage. And Thurston specifically was not a military commander. He had no authority to negotiate the kind of terms a war ends on. He came as a scholar. He arrived at the resistance base on a single transport, alone except for two administrative attendants, and he identified himself to the outer perimeter with something Mira, who was at the perimeter that day, described as studied humility, not fake humility. The Vorkai do fake humility differently, something more effortful. There were several hours of deliberation about whether to let him in. Vashti made the call. Yes. Kale met him in the room they used for outside contacts. A plain space, a table, two chairs, on one side for Vashti's representatives, one large Vorkai-proportioned space on the other. Thurston had something with him. He set it on the table. It was a dented tin flask. Kale looked at it for a long moment. You kept it, he said. Thurston made a sound that the linguist, sitting in the corner with her notebooks, translated a pause as something close to. It required further study. Kale almost laughed. He held it in. What did you conclude? The linguist worked for a long moment, because Thurston's response was complex and her translation was careful. What she arrived at, finally, was this, that the thing the person in Hall 3 did, sitting with the injured woman, the hand-holding, is of the same category as the thing you did in the monitoring hub. When you set the flask down, you were leaving something of yours in a space that was otherwise not yours. Not a weapon, not information. Something that belonged to you, made available to me. The hand-holding in Hall 3 was the same structure. One person making themselves available to another, without instrumentality, without exchange value. I have now reviewed 4 months of exhibition footage looking for this pattern. It is everywhere. It is the most common thing humans do, measured by frequency and duration. It is also the thing I had most systematically failed to study, because I was studying human capability and human behavior in the functional sense, and what I kept recording was human presence. The difference between those two things is what I came to explain. And also to say, another pause, and the linguist's voice changed slightly as she translated, a shift in register, that I was wrong about what you were, and I believe that should be said directly. The room was quiet. Vashti looked at Kale. Kale looked at the flask on the table. That's a good start, he said. The war wound down over the following year. Not cleanly, nothing about any of it was clean. But the pattern catalog spread, and the resistance strengthened, and the Vorkai, who were scholars before they were conquerors, encountered the novel academic problem of being comprehensively studied by their own subjects, and found it, apparently, worth discussing. Thurston was part of the discussions. So was Marcus Harland, who had accumulated more practical knowledge of Vorkai systems than any other human alive, and who brought to the negotiating table the specific quality of someone who had spent 40 years being intensely curious about things that were not yet understood. He found the Vorkai, who were in their own way the same kind of thing, interesting to talk to. This was, Kale thought, possibly the strangest outcome of everything that had happened, and also possibly the most useful. The archive facility became something else, a working facility. Both kinds of people in the same rooms, studying the same rituals? Danvers went there eventually and continued his notebooks. The linguist went there permanently and spent 5 years producing the first comprehensive Vorkai English dictionary, which became one of the most important documents of the 22nd century. Kale stayed in the field for 2 more years. He wasn't ready yet for rooms and tables and careful diplomacy. He stayed with the resistance network, moving through the European theater with a copy of the pattern catalog in his head, and a group of people around him who had learned, in the hard specific school of the previous years, to find the rhythm in impossible places. One evening, camped in the ruins of a building that had been a concert hall before the war, he found Salim sitting on a chunk of rubble that had been part of the stage, humming, 1 step and 3/4. Kale sat down beside him. Do you ever think about the island? Salim asked. Sometimes. I think about the moment in the crossing. When everyone picked up the count, he was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Perot started it. She just started counting, very quietly. And it went through everyone, like it was already in us, and she just reminded us. Kale thought about the war beasts in the crossing, the amber glow of the processing cores. 60 people moving to a count in the dark. My father said we're pattern recognizers, he said, that it's the oldest thing we do, recognizing patterns in the dark, Salsim said, and turning them into music. He looked at the ruined ceiling of the concert hall, the stars showing through the gaps in the roof. That's not bad. As species traits go, that's actually not bad at all. The count ran through Kale's head, easy and familiar now, a rhythm he'd carry for the rest of his life. He didn't say anything. He looked at the stars through the broken roof. They were still there. 1 step and 3/4. 1 step and 3/4.